All right, everybody. It is almost time to get started. For those of you that joined us, thank you so much for clicking on the join button in the lobby of our new Zoom platform. If you were able to find it, next time, go ahead and hit the join button a little sooner. Join us 30 minutes prior to the webcast for pre-show banter, where we talk about nothing, but we have fun doing it. All right, if you're not going to be a part of the Anticast today, please go backstage. That is the backstage button that you can see. Go backstage, and that would leave me alone with Jennifer here.
Wow.
Jennifer has done Anticast for us in the past. She is a person who works with Secure Ideas. She's an instructor for Anti-Siphon and also Secure Ideas. And she is here today to talk about oil, circuits, and cheese, an additive model of failure. Is this the one that like talks about the Swiss cheese model where there's like
Yep.
different layers and then there's always like a hole, and so you have to
hmm
just kind of cover up the holes and
Yeah.
know that someone's going to get through a hole, but then they can't get through the next hole?
Yep. It's
Fantastic.
actually talking about how to line this up too.
Oh,
Uh,
fantastic. All right. So if you have any questions, you can always ask us here on Zoom. You can ask us in Discord. If you ask in Discord, then your fellow attendees will most likely answer the question prior to us getting to it. But if you ask on Zoom, we will get to it the best we can at the end of the Anticast. If you are joining us next week for the Snake Oil Summit, we'll see you there. If not, then we'll be back in 2 weeks with another Anticast. And if this is your first time here, thank you so much for joining us. Jennifer, it is all yours. I'll be backstage. If you need anything, just go ahead and ask, and I'll be right back.
awesome. Thank you. Okay, make sure that I'm in the right screen because Zoom likes to move stuff around. Yay. But before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. So I know you mentioned I am one of the senior security consultants at Secure Ideas. I've been here for about 3 years now. We are headquartered out of Jacksonville, Florida, but I like to jokingly say that we have that we're worldwide. We have like one employee in Canada. But it's real fun to say, yeah, we're a global company with our one employee still in the continental US or North America. Um, Only a handful of us really live in Jacksonville, and even less of us actually go to the office every day. But I'm one of the very lucky ones that gets to go see Kevin Johnson, our CEO, every day. Be sure to wish him happy birthday after this. So I have been pen testing for, I'm going to say about 8 years now, but time is a meaningless construct. I have no real tracking of how long I've been doing this. I've just been doing it for a while, but I got started in cybersecurity as a SOC analyst. So I was blue team at the very beginning, and eventually I ended up moving into a role where I did threat intelligence, and half of that job I was reverse engineering malware, and the other half of it I was doing pen testing. And then after a few years of doing that, I decided that I would rather just do half of that job for about the same amount of money. And so now I just do pen testing, consulting, and also training. So I do a lot of training around API pen testing and API security. So some other interesting facts about me: all around geek. I play video games, watch anime. I don't know if you noticed, I have a bunch of Fallout stuff behind me. I am a collector of things. I'm also a lockpick enthusiast. Um, I am the co-leader for the Jacksonville chapter of Tool, which is the organization of open locks. It is a lockpick group. We currently meet on the second Friday of every month. But if you're interested in getting into lockpicking, you should look and see if you have any local chapters of Tool near you that you might be able to join. And then finally, and this was one that a lot of people always kind of find really interesting, is I read the NTSB and FAA investigation reports for fun. I find them very fascinating. So I'm going to go ahead and give a quick warning. Today's talk is not overly technical. It's mostly a really interesting overview and how disasters line up. And enter the Unsinkable Ocean Ranger. So a lot of people, whenever they think about oil rigs, they think of these big, massive structures that are built all the way down to the sea floor. And that's not what most of them are. Some of them are like that, but that's really more for shallow water drilling. Most of the oil rigs are something called semi-submersible. And that means that there's the superstructure on top of that we can see in this picture, but underneath there are these very long pillars on top of two pontoons. And they're these giant tanks. And these tanks can be filled with water or have the water drained out of them to control how high up or how far down the oil rig is sitting in the water. And because of how deep they sit, they're a lot more stable in the water than most ocean vessels that sit on the top of the water. And this allows them to perform complex operations like drilling. Um, they're usually anchored in place from the chain lockers on each side. There's anywhere between 4 to, I'm gonna say like 12 anchors that'll hold it in place. And also they're very mobile. For short-term movement, most oil platforms are able to move themselves with their own power, but for long distances, they can use either high-powered or tugboats to move them around. So they are not stationary objects. The Ocean Ranger was also the largest of its time. It was 400 feet long, I'm going to say 262 feet wide, and 337 feet high. And it was owned by a company called Odeco. They were the ones that owned it, but it was performing drilling operations on behalf of Mobil Oil Canada and the Hibernia oil fields just off of Newfoundland. So something to keep in mind, especially with the way oil rigs are set up, and this one in particular, they were set up in a way where the actual captain of the vessel does not control anything other than crew operations, the managing of the ballast controls, and the ballast controls are what were responsible for filling or emptying those pontoons that controls how high up or low down in the water the oil rig sits. So on this one, the way that it was set up, the drilling foreman and the tool pusher both outranked the captain. And we can see here the tool pusher worked for Odeco, the drilling foreman worked for Mobil, and then we had Master Captain Clarence House. I'm probably saying his name wrong. Another thing to keep in mind about the captain, though, he was assigned to the oil rig only 19 days before this incident occurred. Um, also, he was put here on a temporary basis. He was meant to be just like a stopgap. He had been in the marine industry for a very long time and had a lot of certifications and what many people would consider, oh, yeah, he's qualified. He had been in non-marina roles, though, for over 10 years. So he hadn't actually been on an oil rig or a ship in a very long time. And suddenly he's captaining this crew. And again, his actual control as captain really just fell down to the ballast control room and training the employees or the crew. The week before this incident, he actually almost sank the oil rig during a refueling operation. He relieved the person running the ballast control room at the time and decided to open up one of the ballast, and it caused the oil rig to list. And whenever it comes to these listing is how much it's leaning to one side or the other. This oil rig has a fault tolerance of 15 degrees. So once it's leaning more than 15 degrees, it is considered irrecoverable at that point. It's likely going to start sinking. He managed to tilt it to 6 degrees, which is a big deal on a vessel of this size. That was not reported at the time. Internally, it was recognized that he had done something very dangerous and he had a fundamental lack of understanding of the ballast controls. So they took no actions to try and remove him following this, but internally, everyone was aware that he had no idea what he was doing. And the captain agreed and said he didn't even want to be there anyways. Um, okay, why is my mouse not moving? So on a timeline of events, and it's important to note that what we're talking about here is the sinking of an oil rig. And it started on February 14th and ended up sinking totally by February 15th. And for the life of me, I cannot remember the exact year right now, but I want to say it was 1985. Um, So about 2:30 a.m., they got a notice that these winds were coming in. They were well aware ahead of time that this was going to happen, that there was going to be a storm coming. And there were two other oil rigs aside from the Ocean Ranger stationed in the Hibernia oil fields at the time. The Ocean Ranger itself was the largest and had weathered much worse storms than this one, but the other two were a lot smaller. And so at the same time that this is going on, there's two other oil rigs with there's a total of three support ships in the area. And a support ship is stationed about 7 miles away from each oil rig. So there was kind of a lot going on in this small area. They were getting regular weather updates, so they knew ahead of time that there was going to be this big storm. Uh, Realistically speaking, the Ocean Ranger wasn't going to have to stop its drilling operations, but the two smaller rigs would likely do that. So there was a lot of communication going on as far as the weather goes. So at 2:30 a.m., when the storm starts rolling around, the wind was just under 35 miles per hour. But by 1:30 p.m. the next morning, or next afternoon, actually, there was a special weather alert issued. This was sent out to every oil rig in the area, plus their support vessels. They were told to expect winds of up to 90 knots, which is about 103 miles per hour, and that they should be expecting swells of up to 35 feet. And the water temperatures at that time would be about 29 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a significant problem. Anybody who's ever, looked into hyperthermia at all, that at that temperature, it very quickly saps your energy. Hypothermia can set in just a matter of minutes, if not seconds. Falling into this water is very dangerous. At 6:58 p.m., the tool pusher updated his boss, the shore-based superintendent, by satellite phone. He said that they were going to stop drilling and disconnect from the drill line because they were experiencing waves of up to 22 feet. Something to keep in mind is that the way that this oil rig is situated at the time, the ballast control room would have been underneath that 35 feet of waves, which is the area responsible for controlling the pontoons on how high up or low down this rig is sitting. Normal protocol whenever you're disconnecting is to raise the the uh, the rig by 5 feet or more by deballasting or removing some water from the tank. This wasn't done at all. So at this time, I think that the ballast control room is sitting about 30 feet above ocean level, which is going to be a problem if we're expecting waves of up to 35 feet. This means that if they don't properly batten down the hatches or if something goes wrong, there is a real danger of the ballast control room taking a massive wave and receiving damage from that. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. At 7:45 p.m., they were hit by a 70 to 80-foot wave, which you'll notice is very large, quite a bit bigger than the 35 feet that they were expecting. But had they deballasted and raised properly, they likely would not have taken nearly as harsh of a hit. They said that there was only minor damage, but that wasn't exactly true. You can see in this image here, that's a porthole. That is one of the windows in the ballast control room. They were the only actual places where water could have come in, realistically speaking. These were used so that they could visually inspect how far above sea level they were. During a storm, they were supposed to use porthole covers. They were designed to be shut or dogged down, but the crew was not trained on this at all. There was also no standing orders policies regarding when to close these hatches. Because of that, because they were just left open, porthole 4 received damage and caused a massive amount of water to rush into the ballast control room. The ballast control panel, by the way, was not designed to be waterproof. That meant that if it got wet, significant damage could be done. And unfortunately, that is what happened. The ballast control panel ended up going haywire at that point. Nearby vessels ended up hearing some of the comms. And the reason why nearby vessels were able to overhear the communication between the crew on the Ocean Ranger is because when the ballast control panel got wet, it took down their internal communication system as well. So they had to switch over to the radios. And some of the nearby vessels overheard them saying that all the valves on the port side were opening by themselves. There are valves operating, they're closing or opening. It's important to note that the way that the ballast control panel works is that they only know if a ballast is being opened or closed if it's lighting up. But because the panel was wet at this point, the lights were kind of flickering off and on at will. They have no real way of knowing if they're actually filling with water. So then the drilling foreman reported to his boss that they were hit by a 50-foot wave. They had a broken port light, but there's no issue at all, and equipment was functioning normally. So at this point, shore base, the highest people in the command here on shore believe that everything is going just fine. At this point, the crew decided to cut power line and the power and the air supply to the ballast control room. When this happens, all of the valves on the pontoons that are responsible for raising or lowering the oil rig are forced closed for safety. So this means even if they had opened, no more water would be coming in. They were going to be closed. They would stay where they were. This is not an ideal state for them to be in, but if they had stayed here, most likely the oil rig would not have sank at all. According to the follow-up investigation reports, they would have weathered the rest of the storm just fine in this condition. They did also stay in regular communication with shore-based radio operators and other nearby vessels. And none of these communications mentioned at all that they were having significant issues. In fact, they were like messaging their support ship or communicating with their support ship saying, "Hey, you guys doing okay? We just want to check on you. We're doing really good. Nothing's wrong. But are you okay?" And like I said, if they'd stayed like that, probably wouldn't have had any issues. But we very quickly enter into some cascading failures. At 1 a.m., they decided to return power to the room. The untrained crew, by the way, opens valves. What this means is when they finally return the water, there were on board these construction rods. These were only meant to be used during construction to test the ballast control pumps, to make sure it would override the control panel and force the ballast valves into an open position. The reason why this is only meant to be used in construction is to verify that they work. They should never have been left on board at all. They were meant to be removed once construction had finished. One of the crew members decided that to try and save the ship or the rig and kind of return it to a proper balance, they were going to start inserting these construction rods. They actually recovered several of them having been inserted whenever they were investigating the wreck in the aftermath. None of the crew actually knew enough about these construction rods to have challenged this other crew member's decision to use them. So nobody said anything. Nobody challenged it, said, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. We don't really know what they do." Nobody really knows why they ended up doing this, unfortunately. So once they started inserting these rods, all the valves on the pontoons at the bottom became open, and very quickly the Ocean Ranger starts to tilt 10 to 15 degrees. And remember, it has a fault tolerance of only 15 degrees. They are also at this point not really communicating with anybody else. Once it had started listing, there was also another significant design flaw with the Ocean Ranger, and that the chain locker, which was responsible for housing the anchor's chain system, was designed in a way that was open and would allow in more water. So once the Ocean Ranger had started to tilt, one of the chain lockers went below the water's surface and very rapidly started taking on even more water. At this point, the drilling foreman uh, calls his onshore superintendent and asked them to send the Mayday signal. However, because of atmospheric interception or interference, this call ended up not making it to the superintendent. It ended up getting relayed to a radio station on shore, and it also ended up getting relayed to the wrong station. Um, there's also something called a telex message that was sent at this time, and this is very similar to a text message through satellite phone. It kind of will blast out to any nearby area. If there is not a recipient assigned to it, this was also sent incorrectly at the time. It was in the wrong format. It didn't have a recipient, so it just kind of got blasted out. Um, in these messages, you're supposed to use the word Mayday. That was never used, either to the call to the superintendent or in the telex. Fortunately, though, the operator that ended up seeing the telex said, even though it says, hey, we're taking on water, we're listing, we're sinking, even though it didn't use the word Mayday, the operator said, this looks really bad. I'm going to go ahead and forward it on anyways. Unfortunately, though, both the message to the superintendent and the telex kind of get bounced around a lot until it finally ended up in the right area for the correct people to be informed that would have been able to issue any type of aid to the Ocean Ranger. They also have a 24-hour monitoring service that they could have contacted and performed the Mayday. So at this point, the oil rig is very much going down. No Mayday has been sent. The few messages that have gone out have been bounced around and sent to the wrong locations because they weren't sent in the proper format. There is another very fatal design flaw with the Ocean Ranger. And actually, let me go back at this point. We can see very clearly what's happening here is that as the Ocean Ranger is sinking, half of it's going under the water and the other half is going very high above the water. This thing is going to be, the side that's above water at this point is going to be very significantly above water. The other major design flaw with this is the way that the life rafts were designed. One of the life rafts at this point would have been completely inoperable to the crew because it would have already been submerged in water. The one that was above the water was on a swinging arm. Now, this arm is designed, and I'm going to use my arm as a example here, but this arm is designed to swing out and away from the ship or the oil rig. And the reason why it does this is it's meant to clear any of the hazardous uh, lips that could be underneath the life raft, is to clear those. So that way, whenever the life raft deploys, the crew's not going to be hitting the side of the oil rig as they go down. But because it's like this, the oil rig is tilting, they couldn't extend that arm. So that life raft would have been almost impossible to deploy at that point. Another thing to keep in mind, there were no survival suits on board. This is extremely important if we are looking at entering water that is as cold as the water was in this time. Survival suits are designed to have automatic flashlights on them or lighting that as soon as they get wet, they're going to start lighting up to make it easier for recovery or rescue operations. For the rescue ships that come in, they'll be able to more quickly identify people that are floating in the water. They are also designed to provide some insulation and prevent that very rapid onset of hypothermia that ends up happening when you get that cold that fast. Unfortunately, by 3 a.m., so keep in mind, they started sinking at 1:30 a.m. Once they finally started sending out those telexes, they very rapidly decided to abandon ship. And whenever one of their support vessels ended up making it over into the area to try and find survivors, they did manage to find one of the life rafts had been deployed, but because of, like I said, it being so high above the water, it ended up hitting part of the oil rig pontoon on the way down, and it had a massive hole in the side of it. Unfortunately, their support ship was not designed in a way that they would be able to actually recover this life raft, even though there were about 30 people inside of it. They could see that through the hole on the side. That ended up sinking before they were able to retrieve anybody from it. And unfortunately, at 3 a.m. is when all radio contact was with the rig was lost. That's when it was determined to have finally fully sank. So if they hadn't been so hasty with their escape, they also probably would have survived a little bit longer, at the very least, for more rescue vessels to get in. This at 3:38, the mobile shore offices were informed that all radio contact had been lost with the oil rig. They did not pass this information on to search and rescue teams. They assumed that this information was being passed on by somebody else. So the search and rescue teams that were coming into the area to try and find any survivors believed that they were looking for an upright oil rig. And as you can see in the picture, this was the following morning. What we see above the water right now is that the oil rig had completely capsized and flipped upside down. Those were the pontoons that were responsible for raising and lowering the Ocean Ranger. The search and rescue teams were not notified until 7:35 a.m. that they were not looking for an upright rig. They were looking for one that had completely sank. So, what does this have to do with cheese? Because again, I just told you this story about a chain of failures that ended up happening, and you're probably like, "Oh, what does cheese have to do with this?" I just want to real quick highlight this. This is a quote from the NTSB's official report. And for anybody who's wondering, oh, no, I'm sorry. This was from the US Coast Guard report. There are several very fascinating reports to look at as far as this specific incident goes. If anybody's interested, I will share links to them at the end of it. One of the things that they noted, though, in their report was this chain of events was not an inevitable progression and could have been broken by competent human intervention. At every step along the way, there were significant issues. The captain was not removed. He did not try to step down. Everybody knew that he had no idea what he was doing. They did not follow protocols for when to raise the oil rig or lower it. They did not follow any protocols as far as trying to close any ingress points for water. They even it goes as far as the construction teams, those construction rods never should have been left on it at any step up until it hit that 15-degree tilt. If somebody competent had intervened in this or interfered with this situation, it probably never would have sank and everybody aboard would have survived. So enter the Swiss cheese model of failure. This was a concept popularized by a man called James T. Reason. He does organizational and uh, he has some very fascinating books. I think one of them was Organizational Accidents Revisited was one that I read not too long ago. He also has a book called Life in Error, where he details the thing that kind of sent him down the path he ended up taking was one morning he was making coffee. He had a lot going on. He knew that he had, I think it was tea actually, he had to feed his cat and he was distracted. And what he ended up doing was putting the cat food in his teacup and the tea in the cat's food bowl. And he spent a lot of time thinking about everything that kind of lined up to cause that to happen. This, and he ended up popularizing something called the Swiss cheese model of error, which I'm a huge fan of. Which is weird to say because you're like, oh yeah, this is to identify medical and like organizational accidents, but I really like the way that it's set up. The idea is that no layer of security we have is 100%. Every path along the way, we have holes in them. And these disasters, catastrophes, these accidents happen when everything lines up just right for the holes to allow this to happen. It's also important to note that the things that really kind of make this are latent conditions and active failures. There's latent conditions. These are not there's no active failure really necessary for this to happen. They kind of act like pathogens that can he compares it to like the clumping together of things in the environment that kind of exasperate smaller issues and can open up the event trajectory. Um, this is going to be things like bad company culture or not holding, or I would say not holding doors open for people, like, you know, getting in the habit of things like holding doors open for people or not following specific safety protocols just because you're saving time, or people not saying stuff. It's really a lot of these that we're going to break down to is some form of company culture issue. One of the big reasons why we had one of the latent conditions for the uh, Ocean Ranger would have been the way their chain of command was set up. They, realistically speaking, with having these two different figureheads reporting in two different directions, and then this one dude over here responsible for training the crew who had no real power over anything. All three of these were going to be butting heads. Nobody really knew for sure exactly who to was going to be making that final decision because there were two at the top. This requires gaps in security to line up just right. So, important factors to consider with this: these effects tend to last longer and they are present in the system prior to an adverse event. Um, these are not massive holes in any of the layers of defense. These are small cracks, but over time, those cracks can grow and grow and grow. And it doesn't have to be a major crack for something to happen. And a lot of time, these latent conditions line up in a way that will expedite, I think is the word I'm looking for, the whatever adverse event is happening. There's also active failures. These are unsafe acts and blatant violations. It falls under these two different categories. Errors are going to be skill-based slips, rule-based mistakes, or knowledge-based mistakes. One of the knowledge-based mistakes we saw on the Ocean Ranger was the crew member who decided to insert the construction rods did not have the proper knowledge on what they did or how to use them. And as a result, it caused the vessel to start sinking much quicker. Rule-based mistakes are going to be things like people are misinterpreting rules, or rules are put in a way that are not actively helping the company. Because, I mean, we've all seen it. Sometimes we see those rules and you're like, what does this even mean? What does this do? Why can't I do it this way? Sometimes rules are not as clear as it should be. And if people are not receiving the proper training, they very easily could misinterpret some of those more critical rules. And then also skill-based slips. There are times where people will do, we end up in a repetitive function a lot of times. There are some parts of our jobs that are just repetitive and we're doing over and over and over again. And I'm going to share a story. It's definitely not flattering to me, but I think it's also important to note that at any level, uh, that everybody you meet is going to make some sort of issue or some sort of mistake in their career. We have all done things that are embarrassing to us. And so whenever I worked in the SOC at the beginning, whenever I was monitoring traffic to look for something suspicious, we had this one company that had administrator logons as an alert. And whenever we saw this, we had to go do research. We had to say where they're signing in from and which admin signed in. And those were just a regular alert that we emailed out multiple times a day because administrators log in and log off a lot. And I got so in the habit of just filling in the blanks and sending them the email that when I got an alert that said an administrator had logged on from China, I just filled in the information and I sent it. Because I was stuck in that it was a very repetitive thing that I did day in and day out. I should have caught that an administrator was signing in from outside of the country, that especially because this was an internal administrator account. That should have been something called a critical call. I should have called the client right away to say, hey, we noticed this. Is this normal? This isn't, or is this, are you expecting this? This isn't normal for you. That is one of those mistakes that I made. And following that, I also spent a lot of time breaking down what exactly went wrong there. And I realized it was that routine. And I had these internal biases of it's very normal to see this. So we kind of have to think about our repetitive functions. What are ways that we can try to either break that up or stay more aware? We have to be careful with some of the things that we're doing, especially if we're on a defensive side of the line. As a red teamer now, I don't necessarily run into these situations anymore where I am doing something repetitive. What I'm doing changes from week to week. Sometimes I'm doing this training, sometimes I'm testing APIs, sometimes I'm testing networks. It changes pretty frequently, but this is especially important whenever we're looking at something from the defensive side of things. And then there's also violations. These include routines or cutting corners, thrill seeking or optimization, necessary, exceptional. One thing that I kind of want to highlight here is, again, I have weird hobbies. I'm going to admit this. I have weird hobbies, but I also happen to read a lot about different nuclear criticality incidents or orphaned sources, which are when a I just saw a laughing emoji because or emoji float by because I know that that is a really random thing. You guys probably weren't coming here to hear about nuclear reactors, but one of the criticality incidents that ended up happening was in Japan. There was a nuclear reactor. It had or a nuclear facility. They had two buildings. One was far less used than the other one, but one was meant to mix chemicals in a certain way in a smaller tub or a smaller vat, and the other one was meant to mix these chemicals in a different way in a much larger vat. But they decided to stop mixing on the smaller one and move to the bigger one because it would save time and cut cost. And unfortunately, one day a team that was not normally responsible for mixing these chemicals together did. And they had no real idea what they were doing. They didn't understand the difference in the bats. They didn't understand exactly what was going on. And it did cause a criticality incident and killed some people. That's one of those examples of cutting the corners or optimization. There were industry defined standards for how to handle these different areas of the nuclear components, but they didn't listen to those well defined standards because they wanted to save money in the long run. And unfortunately, when it comes down to it, like with the Ocean Ranger or any nuclear incident, we end up with new rules or policies in place, and the rules and policies are very frequently written in blood. And in IT or cybersecurity, we have the benefit that very rarely does this actually result in people dying, not nearly to the level of the marine or aviation industries. but that doesn't mean that we should be lax with our rules or our policies and standards. And so Swiss cheese and cybersecurity. Now, just out of curiosity, this was actually something that I think I caught on a pre-show banter not too long ago. Was the Microsoft finally explains the cause of the Azure breach. An engineer's account was hacked. Other failures along the way included a signing key improperly appearing in a crash dump. This was a very fascinating way of kind of look at applying the Swiss cheese model of error. And at the very end of this, I'll talk about how I apply it in my more offensive position. But I think it's really kind of important to take a look at this one. Whenever companies get ransomware or there are these massive breaches, it's never just, oh, a breach happened. It's never just, oh, we have ransomware magically. There is holes along the way that ended or that resulted in this happening. So I want to look at this one because it's one of the few ones that we have that has been very well publicly documented and explained, and we can see along the way each of the active and latent failures. So the very first step in this was the engineer's corporate account was compromised. That is, and if I remember correctly, it was phishing or something like that. And I wish I knew right now off the top of my head, but I don't. Something happened though that resulted in his account being compromised. And when we think about it, I think we have all heard that people are the weakest point of security. A lot of times we can be very up to date software wise, but that doesn't mean that we're not, people are our weakest element, unfortunately. Karen doesn't care about the social engineering training or the phishing training. And I'm going to use Kevin as an example, probably makes some risky clicks sometimes. But because this engineer's account was compromised, this gave attackers access to a development environment that they would not have normally had access to. There was a crash dump that they were able to access from there. Now, it's important to note that this crash dump, there were policies in place, there were safeguards in place that would prevent any of these keys from being leaked in any of the logs. They were going to be sanitized before being written out. But a race condition occurred, which allowed the key to actually be logged in this crash dump. And because this was in the development environment, they did not have logs to see exactly what was happening here. They did not see that any data exfiltration was happening. There was also another 0-day that they used in conjunction with this that would allow access to enterprise email using the consumer key that was retrieved from the original crash dump. And this ultimately ended up leading to the Azure breach. So kind of looking at this from the defensive perspective, we need to ask ourselves, what would set off alarm bells? That story I shared earlier, somebody signing in from out of the country absolutely should have set off alarm bells to me. But what is it that would set off alarm bells for you? At what point is it that you would say something? I know we've all heard the term see something, say something. But again, if any of the crew members had stopped the insertion of the construction rods, they said, hey, we don't know what's happening here. We don't know what this is. We shouldn't do this. It would have at least significantly delayed the sinking of the Ocean Ranger. I also like to identify along the way. One, I kind of need to figure out what are my five, or not my five, but what are my layers of security? And it's really easy to say, well, we have the firewall, we have the WAF, we have an API gateway, but it's not just those. Those are not our only layers in this overall solution. We have the user layer, we have people that are interacting with the applications, we have our internal employees, we have the physical devices that are hosting any of these solutions. there's more to it than just our defensive layers. So within our organizations, we should look at it. What are each of these components that could result in a breach? And what measures do we have to try and protect those components? And I always kind of ask myself, what are 5 things that could go wrong? This is a really interesting way of approaching stuff. Sometimes we do risk assessments where I'm asked to look at a product, and it is very much a thought exercise of trying to figure out what are all the ways that something could go wrong. And it feels a little bit ridiculous because you think about it and you're like, well, one of the things that we are listing as a risk on this is that maybe a user will share their password, or maybe they will end up accidentally copy and pasting their MFA somewhere or something like that. But realistically speaking, those are things that do happen. We just treat them as something that is so inconsequential or so rarely happens that we have these other layers of security that would stop it from being an issue. But unfortunately, those other layers sometimes also fail. So at the end of this, would you be able to identify any of those cracks or holes in your security in the security of your organization? And then finally, we're going to look at the Swiss cheese model from the attacker's perspective. And now it's really easy to say that my job is me. I just go and I start typing on a keyboard and suddenly I've hacked things. But realistically speaking, it's never just a big hack. It's never, oh, I find this massive vulnerability and it gave me all of this stuff. Usually it starts really small, and I chain together a bunch of events, I guess, for lack of better words. I chain together a bunch of stuff, and that's what leads me to actively compromising the organizations that I'm working with. I'm going to use an example from something recently. There was, in one of our original reconnaissance scans, we found that there were browsable web directories. Now, browsable web directories in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean something. It is something that we do usually call out, though, because again, we're giving away just a little bit more information than we need to be giving out to potential attackers. It provides more insight into some of the underlying technologies or how things are structured, and from that, people could potentially craft much more elaborate attacks. And in this case, I knew that I had a wide range of directories that I could look through, and most of them weren't very interesting. There was just like one directory was images, and it was just all of the images that could potentially appear on this one website. That one was quite a boring one to look for. But then I found another directory that had pictures of all of their shipping labels for different products that they were receiving and sending out, which is not ideal for an attack or for a company to just kind of be leaving out for anybody to find. But the biggest issue that I found with it was that in two of their servers, they were running SQL, specifically MySQL, or SQL, however you pronounce it. Because I did have a background of threat intelligence, I managed threat intelligence databases, and I knew how to use MySQL. And I knew that there was likely a script here that it would be using to connect to the database somewhere. And I knew that a connection was happening. I did eventually end up finding it was like, I'm going to say connect.cgi or something like that. Whenever I did it in the browser, if I clicked on it in the browser, I would just get an error about like the socket failing or it wasn't able to connect. But I then took the full link and I did a wget in the terminal. And what that did was, instead of just showing me the error in browser, it downloaded the actual script. And in these scripts, it had not only the database location, but the user that was used for these requests, the password, and the names of the database tables that the user should be or that this script should be accessing. I was then able to take that, because previously I did not know exactly where the database it would be connecting to was. I then used that to sign into the database, and I noticed that even though the actual databases that were being listed in it were just things like, oh, dashboard data, if I go look at that, it's just statistics that would have showed up in the dashboard. But by looking around the database a little bit more, I did find that there was an employee section. They had their employee management or user accounts being stored in the same database as well. And I was then able to grant myself administrative access on the service. And at that point, they were very thoroughly compromised. I did it. I found 2 different databases that had that issue on it. This is something that, again, if they did not have those small browsable that small, it was I believe, an informational finding originally of the browsable web directories, I never would have ended up finding those. And very often, whenever I'm teaching classes, what I say is we try to trigger error messages first because it gives us a lot more insight into what we're dealing with. So all of my really cool, interesting hacks that I've done have started very small like that. It's very rare that I will just immediately have a SQL injection. I will say though, one of my coworkers did try the 1 = 1 and a sign in one time, and it just worked. And none of us expected it to work at all. So that does also happen. But that was less of all of the holes in their security lining up just right, and more of there was just no security apparently. And then finally, and I'm going to open this up for questions. I know that normally these are scheduled for an hour, but this usually is one that only takes about 45 minutes to give. I do want to, before we move into any questions, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the lives of everybody that passed away on the Ocean Ranger. There is a memorial dedicated to them in Newfoundland. So if anybody ever ends up visiting there, it is a place where you could go pay your respects if you wanted to. And I know that I kind of sensationalized this. It was an actual tragedy. And so I did want to take a minute to acknowledge the lives that were lost as a part of this. So, and let me go ahead and pull up Discord and the chat so that way I can see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I'm here too, Jennifer. I just wanted to give a minute for that before I jumped in. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us here today. If you have questions or you feel like something just came up and you're like, I'd like to get that asked. First of all, thanks for being here. And then second, you can go ahead and ask that question inside Zoom or inside Discord, and we'll go ahead and ask Jennifer if you have any questions. If not, I can always ask questions myself. My first question will be, so when you're threat modeling, how much do you think about the Swiss cheese methodology?
So whenever I first started, I didn't really. The Swiss cheese model of error was actually something I ended up finding because I found out that I really liked reading NTSB reports. And it kind of went backwards from there. And now it is something that I do apply a lot whenever I'm doing any type of threat modeling or risk assessment. Part of my job very often is doing the architecture reviews. So I'm spending a lot of time talking with the different development teams trying to get an idea. And I do think that being aware of the Swiss cheese model of error has definitely improved my ability to handle those types of engagements. And I see somebody did ask, they see a lot of channels on there. What are my favorite channels and why? So for long form, I really like Brick and Mortar. I sourced him in one of the slides where I showed the organizational structure of it. I had originally made my own and it looked really bad. And so when I was doing research for this, I came across him, and I definitely want to give a call out to him because that channel is fantastic. He deals almost exclusively with bridges and marine based incidents. So
2 things, Shannon. Go ahead and take off your slides so that way our video goes full size. Thank you so much. My second question for you is that, all right, this is going to be a little personal. Do you see worst case scenarios in regular daily life?
Yes, unfortunately. Now it has gotten, I will say, a lot better over time. I think, like many of us, I definitely have struggled with anxiety.
Mhm.
So already part of that, I'm already kind of seeing worst case scenarios. And I think we've all kind of heard the joke is don't go into cybersecurity. It will just make you paranoid.
Mhm.
But eventually you do kind of reach that point where you're like, I don't care anymore if my attack surface is bigger. I
Yeah.
really like being able to see what's in my refrigerator when I'm at the grocery store.
Yeah.
So, while I used to be like really rigid and uptight about that, I have relaxed because I have decided that sometimes enjoying life is more important.
Yeah.
Um, but again, that's in my own personal life. As far as work goes, I do try to make sure to ask myself these questions very regularly so I don't fall into those routines anymore that could get myself or other people into trouble.
Yeah. Me personally, I'm an assumed compromise kind of person. I just assume I'm compromised and then act
Yeah,
accordingly. So a question from an attendee: do you consider human emotions a critical security hole?
I wouldn't say that it is necessarily a critical security hole. It is worth noting, though, that it's largely going to depend on the individual. I know that we have done some pen tests before where let me try and figure out how to put this delicately because NDAs exist. There were some pen tests before where we were doing a physical engagement and we were only able to get away with some of the stuff because we accidentally did trigger those strong emotions in somebody. Um, like I know Kevin accidentally, he was just playing a role and he made a comment and it made the woman cry. And it allowed enough of a distraction for somebody else to kind of get past her and go inside of the building and steal a computer.
Mm.
And then it was like, okay, let's go give the computer back. Kevin was like, no, I'm not going back in there. I lied to that woman about my living situation and it made her cry. I am
Yeah.
not, no. They need to
Yeah.
come meet us in the parking lot. I'm not going back there and telling her that everything I just told her was a lie.
Yeah.
um, but it is something that we kind of should keep an eye on, especially as far as it comes to physical or I would say email security. Whenever it comes, a lot of those phishing techniques or social engineering attacks that we do see, they very commonly prey on those human emotions.
Yeah. This will probably be our last question during our regular time today. How does a smaller size business prioritize remediation of vulns based on the fact that you start with possibly low or informational severity? Okay, part one.
Ah,
I've always been under the impression, maybe incorrectly, smaller teams would want to focus on patching higher severe vulns. So which one is it?
so let me go ahead and give some context. Whenever we put that finding that I talked about with the SQL database into the report, it was listed as a high, and we definitely indicated in it. While this one is normally an informational thing, we wanted to include it as a high here because it directly resulted in these actions. So something that we do whenever we're writing the pen test report is we try to keep in mind what is the actual impact of this. There have been times where I have downgraded I'm going to use cross-site scripting. I've downgraded cross-site scripting from a high or critical to a medium several times just because the actual potential impact to the company or their internal security controls that they had would significantly reduce the overall risk to the organization. So you definitely want to make sure whenever you're working with a company or you're doing your own internal pen test, while those things might have been informational, the overall impact actually made them a lot bigger. It started that way. And also apply patches, patch update where you can. Very often, that is our first little crumb that we get that leads to a much bigger exploit.
All right, everybody. That is our official time for today. If you didn't know, Anti-Siphon is a training organization. Sometimes, we do these anti-cast webcasts. People don't understand because it's your first time here. So if today was your first time here, welcome. Please join us next week for the Snake Oil Summit. Jennifer, are you attending the Snake Oil Summit next week?
I'm not. I'm actually going to be on site doing another physical assessment next week. So
Okay.
I won't say the state so I don't tip off anybody, though.
Yeah. And are you teaching next week during the Snake Oil Summit
I
teaching
don't
part?
think I am. I do
Okay.
think somebody else from Security might as well, though.
Fantastic. Well, Jennifer, we always love having you here. I always like doing final thoughts because you've given all this, you've told all these things, but what are your final thoughts for people to take with them today if they don't if they don't recall everything, what's the one thing that you would want them to recall?
I think more than anything, hopefully they had a little bit of a good time because I tried to tell an interesting story. But really, whenever it comes down to it, the Swiss cheese model of error, hopefully they'll remember the core concepts of that. And if they are in a position where they do need to consider the security of their organization, ways that that could be applied from that. And anybody who's interested in learning more about it, highly recommend checking out any of the books by Jane's Reason.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, you do have training with us. And so if anyone wants to take a class with Jennifer, I would highly recommend you do so. She puts a lot of time and effort and thought into the materials that she creates. And as you can see, she tells a great story and then works it into so that you can remember the topics. I'd like to invite everyone who would like to stay. We're going to talk about the Black Friday sale that ends today at 5 p.m. Mountain Time and the Snake Oil Summit that's happening next week where Troy is teaching. So Brian, Kyle, if you are unable to stay, we get it. That's why we wait to the very, very end to talk about these things. So if you need to go, cool, go. But if you'd like to hear about the Black Friday sale, we'd love to tell you about it. And then we'd like to talk about the Snake Oil Summit coming up. So Kyle, what is the Cyber Monday, Black Friday anti-siphon sale?
Well, we have an offering here at Cyber Training where you get access to all of our on-demand classes. So often, if you don't know what those are, oftentimes we'll have a class that is just so great, so awesome, it gets recorded, and then we formulate it so it could be taken at, kind of at your own pace through an on-demand platform called Brightspace T2L. So you're able to log in, you can see the slides, you have access to the VMs, you can basically take the whole class as you would live, just at your own pace on there. So we have all of our training classes. Yes, this is our LMS right here. That's what it looks like. All 28 of our classes are available to you for a standard rate of 1,500 for a whole year access to all of these classes. So usually this is reserved for our business to business sales because they buy multiple licenses, things like that. But because this is that time of the year, John is offering this to the whole community. They can get access by an individual license for themselves or through your work. If you do need to go through your business, please just reach out. We can send an invoice instead of doing a PayPal, something like that. But yes, you get access to all of our classes, not just our pay what you can for one low price. So.
And there's any additional classes and any updates to any classes that we put out there, you get those as well. So, and it's going away at 5 Mountain Time tonight.
Yeah. And we do this
6 hours.
Yeah, we don't talk about this stuff a lot during our anti-cast. We mainly say, like, here's some education, here's some things. But every once in a while, we'll hear someone like, why didn't you tell us that you had this? I was like, oh, yeah, we should probably tell people that we have this. We just assume maybe you're on Discord, maybe you're on LinkedIn, maybe wherever you'll see it. Or
we're bad at this.
Yeah.
We're really bad at this.
And then every once in a while, like, you have corporate sales? Like, yeah, we have. Like, you have.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
We sell things.
And then, like, Troy, I'm going to ask you about the class that you have because sometimes people don't know we have this kind of class. So, Troy, what class are you teaching next week?
It's called Network Forensics and Incident Response. So it's being able to, kind of learn the skills in the tradecraft that analyzing network traffic from full packet capture all the way down to stuff like NetFlow or IP fix. But speaking of which, and like adding content. So, and I mentioned this last week, and I'll mention it again here for the class I'm teaching next week. I've added a new module, and we're going to look at Windows for Zeek. So something that they announced last year, like October of last year, where Microsoft and Corelight, the folks that commercially developed Zeek, had teamed up to bring the capability of Zeek to the endpoint in Windows, and to get that visibility, you do have to have the 365 Office 365 license to get that telemetry. And what I'm going to do is I'm adding that, kind of a sneak peek into what that looks like to kind of, put those pieces together from just pure network traffic to network traffic that's being sourced from an endpoint, specifically Windows for Zeek or Zeek for Windows. And for, the good news is if you've already got my class or on demand, you're going to get that content as soon as I make that update to the course. Mm-hmm. So folks that have already taken my class and have it on demand, as soon as the content is done next week, you'll get that update in the on-demand portal as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Appreciate it. Troy, well, I did get a question here, but I'm going to ask you and Shannon, Jennifer. I always see Shannon, and I'm like, oh, that's her name. No, she has two first names. So Troy, I'm going to ask you and Jennifer here a question in a second, but we got a question. Does the pay what you can classes, because generally the on-demand pay what you can classes actually have a base cost to them. Are they included in the $1,500 all you can?
They are.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And then do people get a certificate of completion with the on-demand classes?
Yes,
that will
they
help
can
with
even use
CPEs?
them. Yep, exactly. Yeah, and we can't guarantee that every governing body for the CPEs is going to accept them, but we haven't had any feedback from people saying that it got declined yet. So far so good.
I actually know that because there was one time I accidentally signed into it the wrong way, and I received an automatic certificate of completion for Jennifer Shannon did this training with Jennifer Shannon, and it is one of my favorite things I've ever gotten.
Have that on the wall behind you.
And Eldon has said we probably suck at capitalism. Like, yeah, we do. Like,
yeah,
we do. Appreciate it. Is the cyber range part of the deal too? Do people get the cyber range?
Yes, it is.
Oh, they get the cyber range too. So, all right. So
we're crazy. We're practically giving it away.
All right. So my question for Jennifer and Troy, and then I'm going to ask the same question to Kyle and Brian. A similar question. Jennifer, why do you like to teach?
And I can say this for most of the people that do any type of training with security is I don't want to gatekeep information. I want people to be able to do what I do, and I want to be able to help people reach their end goals. If they want to end up in a position where I am now, I want them to be able to do that. And I feel like training or doing the classes is a way for me to kind of help them do that.
Yeah. Troy, same question. Why do you teach?
That was a great response, Jennifer. And kind of likewise, like my whole career, professional career before even cybersecurity, when I was in the Navy, I did this as well. Like I was learning something, and as soon as I learned something, I was so excited to just share it with the team or with the group. And when I realized, and this is when I was in undergrad and going through some very complex like courses and calculus and ordinary differential equations and stuff like that. And I was explaining because my background in the Navy was an electrician, kind of understanding the fundamentals of how like electrical theory works. I was actually realizing as I was explaining to other people, I was learning better. I was retaining it better myself, and I was making myself better. But not only that, but I was making everybody else, like I was educating everybody else. So that to me always like it resonates with me, going back to that before I was even in an InfoSec career, and just like knowing that nobody out there has all the answers. That like, that whole mentality of like, I'm just gonna, keep this all to myself because of job security. There's no such thing. Like the more you can spread, the more that you can put out there, the more that they're learning, but you're also making yourself better as well. So it's just something I love to do.
Yeah,
that's absolutely something I agree with, is that if you really want to understand something, teach it.
Yeah.
You put in, and I know we say that like, oh, because there's some people out there teaching that maybe don't really understand it, but if you really put in that research, so that way you can try to answer all of the weird questions sometimes, and being able to answer those requires a ton of understanding.
Yeah.
So if you really put in the effort, it absolutely will help you in that area.
Yeah, and 163 of you stuck around, and we appreciate that. If any of you are thinking about teaching, first of all, do it. Second of all, if you want to do it for Anti-Siphon, go ahead and reach out to us about that. But It's not about teaching for Anti-Siphon. It's about you sharing your knowledge with other people, because you're going to help make the industry better. You're going to help make the community better, and you're going to become better by teaching others. So Kyle, you're not a teacher here, but why did you want to come work at Anti-Siphon?
Well, it's actually, I used to be a teacher. I was a high school teacher before this. So the idea of coming on to work for a training and education company was very obviously alluring to me. And not to get too philosophical, but like, knowledge that is like properly appreciated, like demands to be shared, right? Or it ought to be shared, right? So when you have especially we have something valuable that is beneficial to the world, not only to defend the world and protect people's livelihoods and safety and things like that, that should be shared, right? That should be given to the world. And so I just love being a part of a company that is so willing to offer that knowledge to the world for the sake of offering the knowledge, not even for any other reason. So, like, yeah, you know, we have bills just like everybody else. We gotta make sure everybody's taken care of, but that's the goal, and I love that. That's John's philosophy is like we got to get everybody trained in this. Like, let's train the whole world, right? Like that's where we're going to stop. We can stop selling Cipher training when we've successfully trained the whole world, right? So I love being a part of that mission.
Yeah, if anyone wants to know what happens behind the scenes, like we as a team go like, what's the least amount that we can charge for this and cover our bills? like it's not like what's the most maximum like margin that we can create to like, you know, it's like what's the lowest we can go, and then that's where we go. So
we start at free and we go.
Yeah. Brian, why do you work here at Anti-Siphon?
Well, wait a minute. That's a loaded question. Mostly because my brother told me to.
Don't say it.
I actually volunteered for this. I was over on the BHIS side of the house, still am, and talked with Velda about a year and a half ago, and she's like, "I want to hire a bunch of salespeople." I was like, "Whoa, let me do it first." And that was one of the top 5 worst mistakes of my life, deciding that I wanted to literally do the entire pipeline and manage it by myself while continuing to do my original job. Yeah. So why am I over an Additive? So I think maybe what you're asking is like, why do I like the training stuff and what yeah. Okay. So besides, I like the sound of my own voice. I like training because I do have a class coming out, by the way. It's coming out on demand here in the next month or so. I personally, when I first got started in all of this stuff, I had more of an attraction to the blue side of the house. Mostly because I thought our testers needed to be knocked down a peg or two. So the more our blue teamers, the better they can do. I literally want to buy a mug that says a pen tester tears. And put on my coffee. And that I love it when I hear from customers. One of my most favorite things is when I hear from customers that are coming to us for pen testing work or things like that, is to hear from them like all of the cool things that they were able to stop the last time they worked with us, and hear from our pen testers how difficult it was. And I think a lot of what we put out there in terms of the anti-siphon training is going to do more of that stuff. So I get more pen testers sad and crying and calling me up saying, I don't know why I do this anymore. So that's my number one thing that I like is helping the blue teamers, because I feel like they need as much help as they can get. Yeah.
I like that. A lot of the other answers are like, yeah, we just really want to empower people and help them be better pen testers. And you're like, I want to make them all cry.
I want to make I
love training because of my hatred of pen testers.
I mean, you're only going to make them better, right? I mean,
exactly. And it's a game of escalation, right? You get better, then we have to get better. And that stuff you're seeing all the time, even in like, SMS phishing stuff, like, and stuff like that is getting more and more advanced. And we never used to have to kind of think about that stuff, but now it's really important.
And if you're wondering why I asked that question, like, why do you want to be a teacher? Why do you want to work here? Is because, it was an opportunity for us to introduce ourselves. And so, sometimes you're like, who are these people? Why are they doing this? What are they trying to get from me? The only thing we want to get from you is for you to get better. Like, that is what we want to get from you, is for you to improve your career, improve your skills, improve your knowledge, and then hopefully share it with others, because that's the ultimate win for us. All right, everybody, that is it. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you next week at the Snake Oil Summit. And if we don't see you at the Snake Oil Summit, then we'll see you for another Anti-Siphon Anticast in the future. That's it. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Ryan, kill it.